How did a movie with less than $15 million in funding and only about a month of filming go on to win the biggest prize in Hollywood? So, I have to admit, I was totally wrong this award season. If you've been following my channel, you know that there's one movie that I've been rooting for from the very beginning, Everything Everywhere All at Once. But I thought there was absolutely no way that they could win the Oscar. I even made a video about it. To my surprise, when award season got going, the film started to take home awards. First the smaller ones, and then the bigger and bigger ones, and before I knew it, it had become the front runner for Best Picture at the Oscars. It's been an emotional roller coaster for me. And while I'm sure people who know more than me will spend the next few months analyzing how Everything Everywhere All at Once managed to beat out the titans of Hollywood, Steven Spielberg, James Cameron, Tom Cruise, today I want to talk about something that I think has been totally overlooked. The improbable story of how two unknown filmmakers, together with a ragtag team and a budget of just $14 million, managed to create a cinematic masterpiece. And how in the hands of any other creative team, this movie would have probably never been made.
You may only see a pile of boring forms and numbers, but I see a story.
The story of how this awe-inspiring film came together started with just a simple idea. One of the directors, Daniel Kwan, was on a road trip with his fiancée when he was struck with a bit of inspiration. Wouldn't it be cool to make a movie about people who are able to travel to alternate universes and instantly learn skills from their alternate universe selves? I mean, okay, that's cool. That's like standard sci-fi. But if you know the Daniels, no story's complete until you've added something truly absurd to it. In this case, they added this twist. In order to actually tap into their powers from other universes, the characters would have to perform some odd task. Odd is putting it nicely. Now, I don't want to spoil the film too much for anybody who hasn't seen it, but here's a taste.
Sir?
As soon as he got back to LA, he reached out to his colleague, Daniel Scheinert. The two of them had just released the movie Swiss Army Man, which has Daniel Radcliffe, aka Harry Potter, playing a corpse who has special powers.
This happens to everybody, it's normal. Really?
That's pretty freaking bizarre. So we probably shouldn't be surprised that a wacky story of multiverse jumping superheroes was exactly the kind of idea that they'd been looking for. Building on their original concept, the Daniels ended up spending the next 2 years compiling all sorts of crazy ideas. And after years of writing, they finally had a script that they could work with. But by the end of it, what they hadn't realized was just what a monster of a script it had grown into. On the surface, it was a pretty simple sci-fi concept, but it had somehow also become an action movie as well as a sentimental piece about self-discovery. It included elements of sci-fi that required lots of expensive special effects. And since the film takes place in multiple universes, they also needed dozens of different locations to shoot at. I mean, this film would require an army in order to bring it to life. If they wanted to get this film completed, the Daniels needed some serious cash. Big action movies easily cost well over $100 million. If they wanted that kind of money, they needed a big Hollywood studio to back them up. The problem they encountered when they approached the studios was that in order to get the money they needed to brand it as a big action movie. But when the studios opened the scripts, they didn't see an action movie. They saw a story centered around a middle-aged laundromat owner struggling with her relationships with members of her family, and who was also in the process of getting audited by the IRS. Huh? The studios didn't know how to categorize this film. How could they market it? It was a drama, but it was also funny. There were definitely action sequences, but it was also sci-fi. And on top of that, it was led by an Asian cast, which seems more normal nowadays. But even just a few years back when this film was being pitched, this was a hard sell to the studios. This is why the major studios passed on the project. Studios like Apple, Amazon. The Daniels were finally able to convince the studio that had funded their most recent feature film, Swiss Army Man, to help them out. A24. Now, the thing about A24 is that it's a small studio. It's not one of the big Hollywood behemoths, so they only had the money to finance small, independent films. Lucky for the Daniels, though, they had hit him up at the perfect time. A24 had scored a surprise Oscar win for Best Picture, which meant they had a little bit more money to share than they usually did. Because of this, they were able to take a chance on the Daniels. Even so, they were only able to give them a very limited budget. They ended up giving them less than $15 million to work with, which compared to that $100 million I mentioned earlier that usually goes into blockbuster films, was next to nothing. If not for Moonlight winning the Oscar, we may have never gotten Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Moonlight, Best Picture.
Such a low budget presented two big issues for the Daniels. First of all, how are they going to create the crazy visual effects the script called for? The budget for creating effects for films like this alone would have more than exceeded their entire budget. This was clearly not going to happen. The Daniels quickly realized that they couldn't treat this like a blockbuster film project, and instead, they had to approach the project with a strict, low-budget film mindset. The biggest sacrifice they made was to do away with a soundstage. A soundstage is kind of like a soundproof warehouse where you build the different sets you need over the course of filming for a movie or a TV show. But given their budget constraints, the Daniels decided to film the entire project in an actual location. They chose to rent out an entire office building where most of the action takes place. This saved them a ton of money because it meant they wouldn't actually have to create anything. They could actually just use what was already there. Every cubicle was a real cubicle. Every conference room was an actual conference room. Even the janitor's closet where the main character, Evelyn, does her first multiverse jump was an actual janitor's closet. Other locations that take place in the film, such as the bedroom scene between Evelyn and Deirdre, was recreated in the office building in order to save the crew from having to travel between sets, thus saving even more money. I don't know if the Daniels had written the script with all of this in mind or if it was just a lucky accident, but it turned out that an office building was the perfect setting for them to create their film cheaply. Most importantly, because of the low budget, all of the effects in the film were created practically. Now, practically is movie speak for saying that the effects were created with little to no CGI. If you saw confetti flying, confetti is flying. If you saw people with hot dog fingers, well, that's because they used real hot dogs. I don't think that's right. Even the famous moment when Michelle Yeoh's propelled into another universe was created in the most basic way possible. First, the effects artist set up a green screen and had Michelle stretch her arms forward to simulate being thrust backward in the film. With the help of a fan blowing her hair around, they were able to make the movements look realistic. Well, as realistic as a multiverse jump can get. Next, the directors took a camera and walked around town filming random things and then green screened her in to complete the effect. What you have in the end was what ended up being one of the most famous visuals in the whole film. Their next constraint due to the budget was that with so little money, the directors had to shoot in as few days as possible. Every day costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Between paying the crew, renting the set, etc., every minute was money. They literally couldn't afford to waste any time. They ended up shooting for just 38 days. A 38-day shooting schedule is almost unheard of with this kind of film. Most films of this caliber typically have between 6 months to a year to get all the footage they need. This film had just a little over a month. They basically filmed an entire 2-hour blockbuster film in the same amount of time that some big action movies take to film just a few scenes. This is all the more impressive if you consider just how many different shots take place throughout the course of the entire film. Because the film takes place in multiple universes, this meant they had to create a dizzying number of locations. And that's before we take into account the time it takes to film the different scenes and to choreograph the action sequences. With very little money and with very little time, everything was a team effort. The moment the directors would yell cut, every crew member, and even the cast members, the talent, would scurry around picking up confetti, replacing the furniture that had been overturned to get everything back to where it was at the beginning of the scene, just so they could squeeze in another take. What the directors couldn't have prepared for, though, was what was to come at the end of shooting. The end of the world. Let's rewind a bit. Right before filming got underway, a mysterious illness that we now know of as COVID-19 began to spread around the world. By the time they were halfway through filming, it had arrived in the US, and within weeks, the entire world had essentially been shut down. This, of course, included production on all TV and film sets, including the set of Everything Everywhere All at Once. This meant that despite how much they hustled through the 38 days of principal photography, which is what you call the initial shooting dates, they still hadn't gotten all the footage they needed. On top of that, they couldn't even come together in person to salvage what they did have. The entire creative team was locked down in their homes where they had no choice but to forge on independent of one another. This team effort was now going to take on a whole new form, what we all now know as work from home. Most films of this complexity take years to put together, without a worldwide pandemic. Yet these filmmakers managed to achieve the feat of cobbling together the film in about a year and a half. This film would finally reach the audiences at the South by Southwest Film Festival in Austin, Texas on March 11th, 2022. I had actually heard about this film before it even came out, through a friend's Instagram page. I worked with one of the actors in the film, Tallie Medel, who played Becky, Stephanie Hsu's girlfriend. And I follow her on social media because she's always getting involved in really cool projects. Somewhere around late 2021, she began posting about a really cool film she had gotten involved in that was coming out soon. She didn't say much, because I guess these things are like classified information or something. But when the film premiered at the South by Southwest Film Festival, I began to take notice. Typically, you get small indie films at South by Southwest, and since this film was playing there, I just assumed this movie would be the same. But then I started reading reviews about it, and what the critics were saying confused me. It seemed like none of them could put a label on it. It was an action movie, it was a comedy, it was a drama, something to do with the multiverse. I didn't get it. On top of that, there were some big stars in it, Michelle Yeoh and Jamie Lee Curtis. So now I was like, is this indie or Hollywood? What is this? Something else that confused me was that the studio in charge seemed to have put no thought into how they were going to distribute this film. Just a few weeks after it premiered at South by Southwest, A24 released it in theaters on March 23rd of last year, on Oscar weekend. What the heck were they thinking? Releasing your film the same weekend as the Oscars is box office suicide. I mean, really, on that weekend, all anybody cares about is the current crop of Oscar nominees. So this is when I thought, okay, maybe the studio is just not expecting the film to be taken too seriously, so they're just releasing it whenever because, really, who cares? Turns out, it didn't matter when they released it. The few people I know who saw it during that initial release weekend couldn't stop talking about it. According to some of my friends, or my most loyal subscribers, it was a life-changing movie. But just like the critics and audiences at South by Southwest, they just couldn't describe to me what it was about. This definitely created a wave of chatter and curiosity that encouraged me to check it out. When I finally got around to seeing it for myself, I thought it was phenomenal, just like everybody had said. In fact, now I couldn't stop talking about it as well. I told everybody I could that if they wanted to have a film-going experience like they never have before, they had to see this movie. This is probably the best kind of publicity you can get. This kind of word-of-mouth advertisement, I believe, could only have been created by a film like this. It's phenomenal, but at the same time, you can barely describe it, which makes other people curious and want to see it more. This film has drawn in so many curious audience members that it has achieved box office results that exceeded their wildest expectations. In fact, it has become A24's highest-grossing film ever. This little $14 million film has gone on to make more than 5 times the amount of money it cost to make, reaching well over $100 million at the theaters. This is unbelievable, especially considering how it all came together. I was wrong to doubt just how far this amazing film would go. By the time Film Awards season rolled around, all these little critics groups throughout the US started to award their top prizes to the film. From the cast, to the Daniels themselves, to the rest of the creative team. It even managed to pick up the Best Picture prize on a few occasions, beating out more serious films like Steven Spielberg's The Fabelmans and Tar, starring award show favorite Cate Blanchett. And here we are, Oscar gold. Not only has the film picked up Best Picture at the Oscars, but the cast and creative teams have cleaned up as well. Besides Michelle Yeoh, Huay Quan, and Jamie Lee Curtis winning awards for their performances, it feels like everybody involved with the film has something to be proud of as well. In the history of award shows, few films can claim to have left the kind of mark in award season that this film has. Which brings me to just how much this film has changed the lives of everybody involved, most especially the cast. Much of the casting of this film came about after the biggest crap moment that happened during pre-production. The lead actor they had written the script around, Jackie Chan, declined the role. After Jackie Chan declined the role, the writers were forced to quickly rewrite the role with somebody else in mind. They landed on Michelle Yeoh, and they really couldn't have picked a better actress than her. Not only was Michelle Yeoh perfect for serious drama as well as dry comedy, but she could easily step up to the kind of physical needs the role demanded. Remember, it was in martial arts movies that she got her start, and with, of all people, Jackie Chan himself. So it's kind of crazy when you think about how far she's come. This is going to be a career-defining moment for her, and I cannot wait for what she does next. Two of the actors who are sure to benefit from the success of this movie are Stephanie Hsu and Huay Quan. Stephanie Hsu has been acting for years on Broadway, but up until this point, her biggest role on screen was as a recurring character on Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. If If you saw her audition for this movie, which is available on YouTube, you would think she had been acting on screen for years. In fact, right in her audition, I could see just where she would eventually go with this character. She was dramatic and yet funny, but unexpected at the same time. It's clear why she was cast, and the Daniels are lucky to have found her. The most heartwarming story is, of course, Huay Quan. You may not recognize him, but he's actually been acting since before the directors of this film were even born. In the 80s, he starred in an Indiana Jones movie, and he was also in The Goonies. But when roles began to dry up, he took a break from acting and stepped behind the camera. Fast forward to 2019, almost 30 years after his actor retirement, he decided to give acting a go again and reached out to an agent he knew. Just 1 week later, he landed an audition for a quirky little film being directed by two fairly unknown directors, the Daniels. And the rest, as they say, is history. After filming concluded, he wasn't even able to book another job for the entire time the film was in post-production. He lost his health insurance because he wasn't working, which made him desperate for his agent to get him any small job at all. He was so worried about his career that he reached out to the producers of Everything Everywhere All at Once, and he asked them, just tell me one thing. Am I good? Now that he's clutching his Oscar, I think he has his answer. The Daniels, the two crazy guys who came up with this ridiculous idea to begin with, will undoubtedly go on to big things. In fact, they already have a 5-year deal with Universal Pictures. I don't think they'll have to worry about begging for money anytime soon. So that wraps it up for me for this year's award season. What were your biggest surprises? Also, what other movies do you think were snubbed by the Oscars? Let me know in the comments. And if you've made it this far, subscribe to this channel because apparently I don't have enough friends to make it to 1,000 subscribers on my own.